The Pest and Predator podcast is brought to you by Field Heroes, powered by the Western Grains Research Foundation. Visit fieldheroes.ca to learn how beneficial insects can benefit your farm. Welcome to the Pest and Predator podcast. I'm your host, Sean Haney, founder of realagriculture.com. Looking forward to season 4 of the Pest and Predators podcast. It is brought to you by Field Heroes, powered by the Western Grains Research Foundation. Visit fieldheroes.ca to learn how beneficial insects can benefit your farm. Today's guest is Dr. Meghan Vankosky. She's a research scientist in field crop entomology with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada based in Saskatoon. Enjoy the episode. Dr. Vankosky, welcome to the Pest and Predator podcast.
Hi, thanks. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's great to chat with you again. So we're going to talk here today about the Prairie Pest Monitoring Network. How does this network work?
Well, it's a very collaborative group across the prairies. We co-chair it here at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada based in Saskatoon. Owen Olfert, who was the originator of the network, he was always based in Saskatoon, and since he's retired and I've taken over, we're still kind of centered in Saskatoon, but we're co-chaired by Jennifer Otani, who's located at Ag Canada in Beaver Lodge. And we collaborate with the provinces and with a huge number of other volunteers and collaborators across the prairies to monitor insect pest densities and distribution throughout the growing season so that we have some idea of where the pests are and what their populations are so that we can better help farmers and agronomists to make decisions about management.
And what is the network? What is it monitoring for?
Great question. We're looking at the population densities and distributions for about 6 to 7 different insect pests of field crops every year. So we're looking at grasshoppers, wheat stem sawfly, wheat midge, diamondback moth, cabbage seed pod weevil, pea leaf weevil, and swede midge, as well as I might have already said wheat stem sawfly. So it is a list. There are a few of them. And we're covering off the really kind of major pests. Bertha armyworm is the other one. So we're trying to cover off some of the most important or damaging pests of oilseeds, pulses, and cereals across the prairies.
Yeah, a lot of our listeners are like, yep, I got troubles with that one. I got troubles with that one. I think you covered pretty much the full gamut of ones that we're always talking about at realagriculture.com. So now, important, where does the data come from for the monitoring?
Well, our data, some of it is collected by us here at Ag Canada, largely in Saskatchewan and the BC and Alberta Peace River regions by Jennifer, but it's also collected by our provincial collaborators, Dr. John Gavlosky in Manitoba, Shelley Barkley in Alberta, and James Tansey and Carter Peru in Saskatchewan, as well as some of the data, especially for grasshoppers, is collected by the Saskatchewan Crop Insurance Corporation and shared with us so that we can create the regional map for grasshoppers. And then we have, like I said, just so many, too many to list, farmer volunteers and agronomist volunteers who host pheromone traps for Bertha armyworm and diamondback moth and for swede midge. So we're getting data from a lot of different stakeholders in agriculture across the prairies that we're putting into the network to see what that distribution and pest density is.
Yeah, and so there's the pest density and the pressures and those populations, and they can ebb and flow from year to year. Of course, there's a lot of environmental considerations in this, but what else are you monitoring for?
Well, we do dabble a little bit in monitoring beneficial insects, and we do that mostly through our work with the cabbage seed pod weevil survey. And so we're doing that survey when canola is just starting to flower, and flowering canola is very attractive to many different insects. So predators, pollinators, and parasitoids can all be in those canola fields at that time because the canola flowers provide food for the pollinators and the parasitoids, and then other insects are attracted, so that's food for the predators. So we collect sweep samples in canola to count the cabbage seed pod weevils, but we also count all of the beneficial insects that we're finding in those fields as well, to kind of give us an idea from year to year what kind of field hero activity we have across the prairies.
I like it. The field heroes. Nice stuff. Okay.
Yes.
Now, so we've got the data set. We've got the information. How can farmers use this data? How do they get their hands on it?
Right. So all of the maps or all of the data is, well, first it tends to be mapped for the provinces. So you can find the provincial insect pest maps on the provincial websites from Manitoba Agriculture, the Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture, and Alberta Agriculture and Irrigation. I think those are all the right names. They change on such a regular basis these days. But so the provincial maps would be available on those websites. And once all of the provincial maps have been posted, then we post the regional maps so that we can see kind of what's happening across the entire range of the prairies, from the BC Peace River region all the way through Manitoba, for the pests that are present or the pests that are monitored. So there are a few things that we don't monitor for in Manitoba yet, for example, and so then we might only have a map of Alberta and Saskatchewan. But all of those maps are currently, for the 2022 monitoring season, are currently available on the Prairie Pest Monitoring Network website at prairiepest.ca.
And are the maps the easiest way to digest the information?
Well, we really, I would say yes, because the data is tied to volunteers and for privacy reasons, we really only show the data for the prairies in the maps, either by province or across the region, so that we have an idea of what's happening on more of a regional scale, but nothing that can actually be zeroed down to a specific property, again, for privacy reasons. So we use the maps because the visual tools are attractive to people, and it's a good way to, just be able to glance and see what the density was in your RM or in your county, for example. So
yeah, great. And when should farmers start looking for the data?
Well, like I say, the data for the annual monitoring usually goes up in the fall and the winter. So we're so flat out busy during the summer that even for the spring survey, like the pea leaf weevil survey, we don't have time to start mapping that data and actually look at what it means until the fall and the winter. So the maps start going up definitely for January, because we like to have them for winter extension events. But then depending on how busy we are, we tend to have them up by this time of year. So February, March for sure. We have an annual meeting for the Prairie Pest Monitoring Network in March. And so we always have the maps ready for that meeting. And so they either get posted just before that meeting or just after. This year we have them up a bit early in February. But in addition to the regional maps, we also have some information resources that the Prairie Pest Monitoring Network communicates during the growing season on a weekly basis. And so anyone who subscribes to our website would get an email every week that has some real-time, up-to-the-minute information about what we're seeing in the field during the growing season, as well as predictions for what we might expect to see as the growing season progresses.
If there are farmers that haven't been participating in the monitoring network, how do they get involved?
Well, anyone is welcome to volunteer access to their property for surveys, or to ask or volunteer to host sampling sites. The best way to do that is to reach out to the provincial entomologists, or even to myself is fine, but I would say that John, Jim, and Shelley are probably the best first contacts. Shelley especially is really active on Twitter at this time of year, looking for volunteers so that she can get onto fields and find fields starting early. So that's one way to get involved for sure. Just to contact us and say you're interested. But if you're more interested in the information and if you're more interested in the information, then definitely visit the website, consider subscribing to the weekly updates, because then those come right to you and you can read through and focus on the information that means most to you and your farming system as compared to the prairies on the whole, for example.
Great stuff. So if you think back to 2022, what are the maps showing us in terms of maybe the biggest surprise from the monitoring effort for the past growing season?
Well, we've been waiting for a Bertha armyworm outbreak for a number of years now, and it still hasn't happened. So I would say that that's kind of a surprise. The Bertha armyworm cumulative catch in the pheromone traps was generally lower than 400 moths per trap. So the map for Bertha is very pale green all across the prairies. Who knows what's going to happen in 2023? It could finally be a year that we start to see those populations build. But Bertha armyworm were still a bit of a surprise. Not a surprise, but grasshopper population densities definitely seem to be on the rise, especially in the more southern parts of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. I was out myself late last summer to do a species composition survey where we're just sweeping the ditches to see what species of grasshoppers are present and at what densities they're present. And the further south, the closer to the US border I got, the more grasshoppers there were. The highways were black in places with all of the dead grasshoppers. So again, not a surprise, but definitely something to keep an eye out for in 2023. Although with a cold spring being forecast, that could have a negative impact on the grasshoppers as well. So I would say that scouting for grasshoppers is probably going to be very important, and that's really consistent with all of the messaging that we've been getting out there this winter season for outreach. And then I guess we don't monitor hundreds and hundreds of sites for Swede midge because they're a species that we don't have on the prairies, but we are watching for them with these pheromone traps because we're concerned that they could be moving further west. And this past year, we didn't find any Swede midge in the traps, which is a great thing because it means, again, that hopefully we still don't have any Swede midge populations in Western Canada, which is great for crucifer vegetable growers and canola farmers.
A question I love to ask entomologists is because there's a lot of options, and you're like I mentioned, you're covering a pretty wide swath of pests with the Prairie Pest Monitoring Network. What's your favorite pest to cover? What's your favorite insect?
Oh, well, those are two different questions. My favorite insects tend to be weevils and parasitoids because for very different reasons. Weevils tend to be pests. They're all herbivores, but they're just so charismatic for insects. They've got long noses and hard shells and kind of stumble along almost like little elephants on plants. They play dead when they're disturbed, which is super cute because then they just fall to the ground and sit there motionless until they think that you're not looking anymore. So weevils are pretty cool. But parasitoids are one of my favorites in terms of the beneficial insects or the field heroes. They tend to be very specific, and they're just very beautiful little wasps that are all different colors and are just so good at finding their hosts, even if their hosts are inside plants. It's like the wheat stem sawfly, which is an important pest, has a parasitoid that can find the larvae inside the wheat stems and then from the outside, and then inject her eggs into those larvae or right beside those larvae so that the larvae end up dying. So those are some of the favorites. Lately, the grasshoppers are probably my favorite to survey just because there's been so many of them. So they've been easy to find and you know that you've got them in the net. So
great stuff. Well, Dr. Vankosky, thanks so much for joining us here today for the Pest and Predator podcast.
It was my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. And anyone who wants to learn more about the Prairie Pest Monitoring Network, this is the shameless plug. Please do visit the website or reach out to any one of us who collaborate, and feel free to ask questions or volunteer access to property for monitoring. We would really appreciate it.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Pest and Predator podcast. It's brought to you by Field Heroes, powered by the Western Grains Research Foundation. Visit fieldheroes.ca to learn how beneficial insects can benefit your farm.